Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we're talking about the Black Mage of Fabula Ultima, the primary offensive spellcaster. We're talking about the Elementalist, and by all accounts, the Elementalist is probably one of the coolest classes that leads to some of the coolest ideas, because inherently within the class, it mixes both martial and magical capabilities. Even though it's predominantly a magic casting class, it's definitely focused on dealing the hurt in many different kinds of ways, which makes it an incredibly powerful class. Starting off, we're going to talk about its free benefits. You get 5 mind points and the ability to cast rituals with the ritualism discipline. This is pretty basic for most of spellcasters. We're going to see the same setup for many of them going forward, so get used to it. But the 5 mind points is really good, and honestly, due to how the Elementalist blends really well with a lot of the more martial classes, this is a really good class to pick up because it can give you a bit more mind points that you're going to want, and as well, it's going to give you some good offensive capabilities for your kit in case enemies are flying or need a specific element in order to be hurt. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at their skills because they're really, really cool. First and foremost, we're going to talk about their elemental magic. This will give them a new spell every time they select this, and these spells are cast using both insight and willpower for the magic check. Now, we'll get into the spells here shortly, but I did want to point out with this one that there are 10 skill levels you can potentially take, which means you can take 10 spells. Granted, I don't think you should do that because there are other skills here that are really good, and since you only get 10 skill levels you can invest in, you're going to want to save some of those points for some of the other skills we're about to talk about. Though, regardless, if you're going just full-blown caster and you don't need anything else from here, then yeah, sure, I guess. But even then, casters are actually going to be able to get some really good benefits from this class. And since I've been talking about it a lot, let's go ahead and look at how the Elementalist blends with both spellcasters and martial characters. Starting off with Magic Artillery. So Magic Artillery allows you to, as long as you're wielding an arcane weapon, to add a bonus to your magic checks equal to your skill level times 2, which is absolutely insane. So even taking this once will increase the accuracy of your magic checks by +2, which is a lot. And what's even crazier is you can take this one up to 3 times, meaning you can get a +6 on your spell casting checks. Honestly, due to how the general accuracy works in this game and how armor class for enemies doesn't really increase armor class defense, I should say, defenses for enemies doesn't really increase all that much throughout the entire game. I will say even just getting the +2 by itself is probably more than enough. +4 if you're really feeling like you want to hit every single one of your spells. I think the +6 would be excessive, to be honest. I don't think that's going to come up that often, but since you are rolling 2 dice to determine your overall accuracy in this game, the bounded accuracy tends to be a lot more centralized, so +6 would allow you to hit, on average, almost every single time. So that being the case, I would say that Magic Artillery at full rank may be a lot, but it will make it so you will almost never miss. Though, obviously, if you roll 2 ones, not really anyone can help you there. Regardless, Magic Artillery is really, really strong. Next up, we'll also talk about Spellblade, which works for martial characters in not the same way, but it allows a martial character to use the magic of an elementalist with the accuracy of a martial character, which will be much more beneficial to them. So Spellblade, what it does, as long as you're casting an offensive spell that's targeting a singular creature, and it has a total number of mind points for the cost equal to skill level times 10 or lower, which, to be honest, only 2 points in Spellblade is really going to be all you need, as some of their strongest single target spells are only 20 damage. But there's a slight caveat to that. We'll cover that in the next skill we cover. Getting the full amount of skill points might be necessary depending on how you want your build to go. And you are using one of the weapons of the bow, brawling, dagger, flail, spear, or sword weapon groups equipped. You may choose one of those weapons, and if you do, your magic check for the spell will use the chosen weapon's accuracy check for the formula. The magic check for an elemental spell cast through a weapon, such as a bronze sword, for instance, will use Dex Might instead of Insight Willpower. So overall, this is really good. And the interesting thing about this one is it states specifically, if you do the magic check for the spell, we'll use the chosen weapon's accuracy check. It doesn't state specifically the damage. So typically when you roll a spell, it's high roll for the magic. I'm assuming in this situation that you're going to use the high roll for your accuracy check, which would make sense. But I just wanted to specify that for people who might be a little confused on that. Regardless, what this mainly does is it allows you to use your weapon, which your character might have better stats for, rather than Insight Willpower, making this perfect for any character who wants to add some elemental damage or elemental capabilities to their character. And honestly, many of the spells from the Elementalist hit like a bus. So Spellblade is something you're definitely gonna want to take. And so this is why I said, even though you could pick up 10 spells, if you really, really wanted to, you're gonna want to save 2, maybe 3 points to invest in something like Spellblade or Magic Artillery for whatever your spellcasting needs are. But as I was mentioning in Spellblade, the cost of a spell, even though their single target spells tend to be 20 mana points, you can actually heighten these spells by investing more mind points with their Cataclysm skill. So what Cataclysm does is, as long as the spell is instantaneous, which means it doesn't have a long duration, it's just a one and done. And if you have an arcane weapon equipped, which in Spellblade's case means that you can have an arcane weapon in one hand and a melee weapon in another. There are some situations where you can do this, and some weapons can even be made into arcane weapons. So something to keep in mind. But as long as you have an arcane weapon equipped, you may increase the spell's cost by skill level times 10 mind points. Every 10 points you put into this will increase the amount of damage it deals to all creatures the spell damages by 5, which, since you can take Cataclysm 3 times, indicated by the star in the top right corner, you can see that we can add up to 15 extra damage if we increase a spell cost by plus 30, which is a metric ton of extra damage to add on. Granted, this is the kind of skill that if you're going to pick it up, you want to pick it up towards the end of when you're investing in Elementalist. The increase in damage is good, but honestly, spending 20 points to add an extra 10 damage to a spell that normally does 25 damage and high roll on 20 mana points isn't really cost effective. So this is more meant for bursting down enemies or when you have more mind points than you even know what to do with. So Cataclysm is really good. I would recommend taking it towards the end, and only if you're going in a build that's going to have more than enough mind points to spread out. Next up, I'll talk about Ritual Elementalism. This just gives you the rituals in the Elementalism discipline. These use your Insight Willpower, same as all your other spell casting. These are actually genuinely pretty good because the rituals you have are ones that affect elements specifically. So if you want your team to walk on water, for instance, this is going to be the kind of ritual you're going to want to do. Or to summon tornadoes, or to cause a rainstorm, or like, there's some really cool things you can do with elementalism specifically, and the rituals are really cool. So as long as you're very creative, like many of the other ritual disciplines, this is going to be a good one to pick up. But if you don't want to spend the extra point for something that's so vague, that's also understandable. Regardless, I particularly like it, but I'm also someone who likes to have the ability to kind of adjust the story as necessary with some creative use of magic. But let's go ahead and now talk about the spells. Now, the spells, I'm not going to go over each spell. I'm going to cover the types of spells they offer, at least here in the core book. And of course, you and your GM can always work out a new spell if you feel like there is one that kind of matches the game's overall balance. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these spells. First, we're going to talk about Elemental Shroud. This one is really good. It can target up to 3 creatures, and the spell lasts for this scene. And what it does is you spend 5 times the number of targets, so up to 15 mind points, to give each of the targets a resistance to a type of elemental damage of air, bolt, earth, fire, or ice. So for the rest of the scene, up to 3 targets get resistance to a particular type of damage, which is really good. Now, of course, these are only the elemental types, and there are definitely more damage types out there, but that's not really a big deal because honestly, if you're going up against an enemy that has elemental types, they use 1, maybe 2 different elements often. So that being the case, picking this spell up is a really handy one if you just are going for a sheer number of spells. So if you're going up predominantly a spellcaster, this is decent to pick up. And also, if you're going a martial style character, you can just give yourself a buff that can heavily increase your survivability. So something to keep in mind. And speaking on martials, actually, let's talk about Elemental Weapon. Now, Elemental Weapon is very interesting because you spend 10 mind points to enhance one weapon for the rest of the scene with an elemental type of air, bolt, earth, fire, or ice damage. Now, if you're casting this on your own weapon, then you can perform a free attack as a part of the same action, which means you're not just buffing yourself, but you're also getting an attack out of this action, which makes it very efficient. Now, obviously, this only works on any willing, predominantly allies' weapons. You can't target an enemy's weapon and make them do fire damage when your whole team has, maybe fire resistance from the last spell we talked about, Elemental Shroud, which, would have been great, would have been kind of cheesy. I probably would have allowed it, honestly. But this spell specifically says it has to be on a willing creature. So, yeah. But if you're going a Spellblade route, then this is a must take because not only do you get access to do an elemental damage type that enemy probably has some vulnerability to, but you get to attack as well, meaning that there's really no loss of action economy, which makes Elemental Weapon really good. Honestly, I love this kind of design, and I love how this works so well with certain playstyles. Even if you're just using as a buffer, I mean, that it can make your marshals do really good damage. And since you're already probably an offensive spellcaster, this just increases your team's overall damage, which really is solid. But if you're a martial Spellblade, then this gives you just the ability to enhance your own abilities and increase your own effectiveness. So the ways this can be twisted in different aspects of play is something that I really like and shows really good game design. Next, we're going to talk about Flare. Now, this is a single target damage spell, and they pretty much all do the same thing with maybe some exceptions, but predominantly they do the same thing. So Flare, 20 mind points, targets one creature. This one is instantaneous, so remember that for Cataclysm. This one does high roll plus 25 fire damage, and damage dealt by this spell ignores resistances. Not immunities, but resistances, which is more common. So most of the single target spells that we're going to come across are going to do a element, high roll plus 25, ignore resistance damage, which makes it really good. Now, if you do want to go a pure elemental route and you want to go very offensive, then you're going to want to have a good spread of elements, but it will become kind of tedious because there's 5 elements. So getting 5 single target spells, that's half your entire skill points. And unless you don't want to take any of the other really good skills in Elementalist, you may have to pick and choose what elements you're better with than others. Speaking on using types of spells and elements, let's look at Fulgur. Now, Fulgur is a bolt version spell, but this one is multi-target. So this spell does 10 times the number of targets, so up to 3 creatures, for a maximum of 30 mind points, 3 creatures. Each of these creatures hit by this spell take high roll plus 15 bolt damage. Now, it does have this additional part here, opportunity. Now, typically, you can spend an opportunity to target a singular creature that is affected by an attack to be inflicted by Dace. And technically, it doesn't even have to be one affected by the attack, technically, with the use of opportunities. But with some spells, like Fulgur and actually all the other area spells in Elementalist, they will do like a condition to all targeted enemies. So this one would do dazed to each enemy hit by the spell, which is pretty good. So not only can the spell potentially, hit 3 targets, but can also potentially daze 3 targets as well, which I think is really good. And honestly, even though this does 10 less damage than the single target spell, just hitting one other target, so 2 targets, you'll be doing at minimum a base damage of 30 plus twice your higher roll damage for that round, which is way higher than single target damage. So you're definitely going to want to have some multi-hit spells. And honestly, I would probably get more multi-hit spells than single target spells. Granted, if you're going the Spellblade and you want to do the single target use your weapon thing, then yeah, single target spells are better. And that's why I love the Elementalist, is there are different routes you can go through with some of these spells to target different styles of play. Being a Spellblade who focuses more on single target damage, or being more of a caster who focuses more on area damage. And the thing is, you can kind of just have a little bit of both depending on your playstyle. That's a great thing about Fabula Ultima. You can play really however you feel fit. And that's something I really appreciate about this game. Rather than covering the rest of the spells that do more or less the same things as the last couple spells, let's just look at some of the other unique spells offered here in the core book. So first off, we have Soaring Strike. Soaring Strike allows you to immediately perform a free attack with a equipped melee weapon, and this attack can target creatures as if the weapon had ranged. Now, if you use a weapon that belongs to the spear or brawling group, this attack deals 5 extra damage, and if it hits a flying creature, that creature can be forced to land immediately. And this only costs 10. So what I really like about this kind of spell is it offers a Spellblade, for instance, the chance to affect range enemies in not just using a spell on them kind of way, but instead in a I attack them with my weapon kind of way, which I'm sure many Spellblades out there will appreciate. The 10 mana cost is honestly really not that much. You can do this several times in a fight. And I really like how this has some weapon specialization in it with Brawling and Spears, meaning that certain weapon groups can play very unique playstyles with Elementalist added on, and that's for a martial fighting style, which I think is really cool. So yeah, Soaring Strike is really good in my opinion. The last spell we'll talk about is going to be Vortex, and this is actually one of the very few defensive spells along with Elemental Shroud that Elementalist has. This one is a 10 cost. It only can target yourself, and it lasts for the scene, and it gives you a +2 defense against range attacks. That's pretty good, honestly. Now, it really depends on the kind of combats you're going up against. Many enemies that have ranged attacks might just be spells that target multiple people and might not have the ranged modifier on them. So that's something to really keep in consideration. This is really good if you're going up against enemy types that are constantly using like range attacks, or flying enemies almost always use range attacks. So Vortex is pretty good, but it really depends on the style of campaign you are. Regardless, I really appreciate that this is here because this is something I would think of using with ritualism. And since rituals take longer to cast in combat, the fact that this is just a spell, it makes it so much easier. And it's only a 10 cost. So again, something that can really improve your character's overall survivability, whether you're a full caster or a martial Spellblade. So overall, really good. These spells are just some examples, and of course, you can always come up with new ones. Fabula Ultima is a game all about coming up with your own stuff, working around these kind of general conventions for your spells. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the heroic skills. And I should say a couple. There's not many spells that are really meant for Elementalist specifically. Elementalist has access to a lot of heroic skills, but many of them are shared with pretty much all the other pure spellcasters. So rather than going over each of those in each of my videos, I'm just going to go over the ones that are predominantly focused on the Elementalist. So in the core book, there's actually only one heroic skill that only focuses on the Elementalist, and that is Volcano. Though it is a really good spell, it is also very expensive. And when Elementalist is your first class that you're planning to get to mastery, this one might be a bit expensive at that time. So Volcano is really good because it is a diverse spell that can do one of two things. It can either damage one enemy for 50 damage, which is a lot of damage, fire damage specifically, or any number of enemies for 30 damage. So all you need is just two enemies, and you're almost always going to use the multi version because you're just going to get more damage overall in the fight. Though, if you're trying to burn down a specific enemy, the 50 damage might be good. Now, the great thing about this damage is even though it's fire damage, this spell ignores all resistances and immunities, meaning this is the ultimate spell. There's no enemy can resist it. As long as you hit them with the spell, they are toast, like literally. And this does have some scaling. At level 20, you get 5 extra damage, and at level 40, you get 10 extra damage. So, that being said, it's pretty good. It is 40 mana points, though, or mind points, which is a lot. Oh, and I was completely wrong. I said if you hit the enemy. There's no hit. It just does damage. It just does damage with no resistance. No, the enemy can't defend against this spell at all. So yeah, 40 mind points is really expensive, but holy crap, can you just hurt everything on the field without needing to worry about hitting them, which is insane. And you might be saying, well, it's obviously an offensive spell, so you do need a spell check. It isn't, and I didn't see anything in the errata that says otherwise. There's no indicator for offensive spell. So either one, this is something missed, which is always a possibility, or this just does damage. Now, considering this is an ultimate spell and it has such a high mana or mind point cost, I would say if it just hits the enemies, that's all fair and good. That it's a lot of damage, true, but it's your ultimate spell. But if you want to make it roll for accuracy as well, fine as well. The problem is that this benefits nothing. There's no high roll damage or anything on here, which kind of sucks in that regard. Regardless, I would say Volcano is really, really good no matter how you play it. It's a very powerful spell, and you could skin this however you want with any elemental idea, because it doesn't really matter what element it does anyway, typically, as the spell ignores any resistances and immunities. Granted, there might be some effects that apply specifically to the element. I would say even if you changed it, it wouldn't make that big a deal, because, I mean, there's no element that I feel like has higher priority over others for enhancements or buffs, so it wouldn't break the game in as well. So if you don't want your character to have Volcano, maybe a Void, or it has to be elemental, so maybe you have, like Giant Glacier or Iceberg or something to smash into an enemy. Regardless, I think this one is really cool. And the only other heroic skill that specifically revolves mostly around Elementalist actually comes in the Techno Fantasy Atlas, which is Arcane Soldier. Arcane Soldier requires that you have one or more of either Elementalist Sharpshooter or Weapon Master mastered, but you also need to have at least 2 offensive spells. So technically, Elementalist is the stronger focus here, even though this is applying to a melee attack. And, well, kind of. Not even necessarily just a melee attack. So, Arcane Soldier, what it does is you may use an action to perform a free attack with a weapon you have equipped. This attack must target a singular enemy, and if the attack is a success, you treat your high roll as 0, so you don't get any extra bonus damage. You just do essentially your weapon damage. That's kind of lame, but any kind of multi-hit abilities do the same thing. And, well, not multi-hit, but like using 2 weapon kind of abilities, dual wielding, does the same kind of thing. And that's because after the attack has been resolved, you immediately perform the spell action, which, as a free action, and this spell you cast must be an offensive spell with a total mind point cost equal to or lower than 20. And it also may only target 1 enemy. Now, you treat your magic check's high roll as 0 when determining the damage or other effects caused by this spell. So you cannot heighten this with Cataclysm that we talked about earlier, but all the offensive spells are single target R20 cost, so that works anyway. And they all do 25 plus high roll, which would be 0. So essentially, with Arcane Soldier, you can make 2 attacks, 1 spell attack, 1 melee attack, and you still have to spend the mind points and everything, but there's just no reason not to do this. I mean, seriously, choosing not to do this, you would have to be using another action, which, could be the case, especially if you're going a Spellblade who has really poor insight willpower. You might not select this one because the Spellblade might be your main way of hitting enemies. But if Spellblade isn't the primary way you're trying to hit enemies with spells, and you have actually a decent insight or willpower, or predominantly both, then Arcane Soldier is really, really good because you're essentially getting off a full attack plus a spell attack at the same time, which just is solid and does a good amount of damage. So overall, the Elementalist is really good. It is the battle mage. It is the predominantly offensive spellcaster with some good utility spells kind of mixed in with it as well. It blends in with all kinds of different spellcasters, martial casters, even though a lot of what I talked about today was very focused on the martial blending aspects. That's because that's the most unique element of Elementalist compared to some of the other casters. But I will say that Elementalist is still really good in a pure casting build, as with Magic Artillery, you can make it so your spells almost never miss, and with Cataclysm, making it where your spells just do more damage if you're willing to pump in the extra mind points is really good for a full caster build. Plus, they have so many ways they can use arcane weapons to enhance their capabilities. So they do work as a full caster as well. I love Elementalist. Its design works in so many different styles of play, whether you want to play a little bit of support, full offensive casting, or as a Spellblade. You even have some slight defensive options mixed in there. It can blend into so many different styles of builds, and you can see many builds out there for Fabula Ultima that include Elementalist predominantly for its Spellblade, which, makes a lot of sense. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully y'all liked it. If you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. It increases the chance that the algorithm picks it up, and hopefully it lets more people see Fabula Ultima. And if you like my content specifically, especially since I talk about all kinds of different tabletop games, then I recommend subscribing as well, as I try to cover as many games as possible, and I'll be covering all the classes of Fabula Ultima here on this channel, plus a rules video that is going to be coming out soon. But regardless of any of that, thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.